Somewhere, a person lived an entire life born, loved someone, lost someone, died in a place and a time none of us will ever be able to name. And today, there is no trace of them left anywhere. On Earth, not a name, not a grave, not a single object they ever touched. This isn't a rare exception. It's closer to the rule than most people ever stop to consider. Written history covers roughly the last 5,000 years. Modern humans have existed for at least 50 times that long, which means the vast majority of everyone who ever lived left absolutely nothing behind for us to find. It's easy to assume history is basically complete. Museums are full. Textbooks are thick. Archaeologists keep finding new sites, and historians keep filling in details. It feels like a mostly finished puzzle, with just a few stray pieces left to locate. That impression is almost entirely an illusion, created by exactly the wrong kind of evidence to judge completeness by. Writing itself is barely 5,000 years old, invented independently in only a handful of places, and only gradually spreading everywhere else after that. Anatomically modern humans, meanwhile, have existed for roughly 300,000 years based on current fossil evidence. Do the math on that ratio and something uncomfortable becomes obvious. For well over 90% of the time modern humans have existed, nobody was writing anything down, not names, not events, not the ordinary details of daily life that make up the overwhelming majority of any person's actual existence. Everything from that period survives. If it survives at all, only by accident, a stone tool dropped in the right spot, bones preserved by unusually specific soil conditions. Nothing preserved deliberately for us to eventually find. So the honest starting point for this entire video isn't a list of what we know. It's a much harder question. How much is actually missing? And what does that missing portion of the story genuinely look like? Archaeologists have a specific term for this problem, borrowed originally from statistics: survivorship bias. It describes the tendency to draw conclusions only from what managed to survive while completely ignoring everything that didn't, simply because the evidence for its absence is, by definition, absent too. A famous version of this bias shows up in a completely different context: World War II engineers studying returning aircraft covered in bullet holes, initially planning to reinforce the areas most densely hit, until a statistician pointed out they were only looking at planes that survived being hit there. The planes hit somewhere else never made it back to be studied at all. Archaeology runs on almost exactly the same blind spot, stretched across tens of thousands of years instead of a single wartime campaign. What survives to be excavated and studied isn't a representative sample of ancient life. It's whatever happened to be made, of durable material, buried in the right conditions and left undisturbed long enough for someone to eventually dig it up. Everything else, and there was almost certainly far more of everything else, simply isn't there to examine. Even the human fossil record itself, foundational to understanding our own species' history, is astonishingly sparse when you actually look at the raw numbers. The total number of hominin fossils recovered and studied across the entire scientific history of paleoanthropology can be counted at most in the thousands, representing an almost incomprehensibly small sample, compared to the billions of individuals who must have lived and died across that same span of time. Entire regions of the world remain barely explored for fossils at all, either due to unfavorable preservation conditions, difficult terrain, or simply a lack of sustained research funding directed toward them. Start with language, because it might be the single clearest example of exactly how much simply vanishes without anyone intending it to. Linguists estimate that roughly 7,000 languages exist in the world today. Historical linguists studying language change over time believe the true number of languages that have ever existed throughout human history is almost certainly many. Multiples of that, the overwhelming majority of them spoken by small communities, never written down at all, and gone the moment the last fluent speaker died, taking every story, every song, every specific way of describing the world that language contained along with them. There's no partial record for most of these, no fragments to piece back together later. A spoken language leaves essentially no physical trace of its own existence, unless someone specifically transcribes it before it disappears, and for the overwhelming majority of human history, nobody was in a position to do that. This isn't purely a distant historical problem either. Linguists tracking language endangerment today estimate that a meaningful percentage of the roughly 7,000 languages still spoken are at serious risk of disappearing within this century alone, some with only a handful of elderly fluent speakers left, and no younger generation learning them as a primary language. Each time one of these languages loses its last fluent speaker, the process that erased the vast unrecorded majority of human linguistic history plays out again in real time, sometimes within the span of a single family, a grandparent's language never quite making it to their grandchildren. Individual human lives follow a similar pattern, just at an even more staggering scale. Demographic estimates suggest that somewhere around 100 billion people have ever lived on Earth. The vast majority of them left no written record of any kind, no marked grave that survived, no personal possession that made it into any collection or museum anywhere. Even burial itself, often assumed to be a reasonably reliable way for evidence of a person's existence to survive, turns out to be far less dependable than it sounds. Most burials throughout history involved no durable marker at all, just a body placed in the ground, sometimes with a few perishable grave goods that decomposed alongside it within decades. Cemeteries themselves get built over, plowed under, or simply forgotten as population centers shift over centuries. Archaeologists estimate that the number of burial sites actually located and studied represents a vanishingly small fraction of the total number of burials that must have taken place across human history, the overwhelming majority sitting completely undiscovered or already destroyed by later construction, farming, or simple erosion. Their names, their specific worries, the jokes they told, the people they loved, none of it survives in any recoverable form. What we're left with across the overwhelming span of human history isn't really their story at all. It's a small number of physical objects that happen to survive, studied by people trying to reconstruct a life from fragments that were never meant to serve as a complete record in the first place. The type of evidence that does survive skews the picture even further, in a specific and predictable direction. Stone tools last essentially forever, which is exactly why prehistoric archaeology often gets nicknamed the Stone Age, even though stone was almost certainly a small fraction of what people actually used day to day. Wood, plant fiber, leather, and woven material, likely used constantly for containers, clothing, shelter, and tools, decompose within decades or centuries in most environments, leaving behind essentially nothing for archaeologists to find. The tools people relied on constantly for ordinary daily tasks are, in many cases, precisely the tools least likely to have survived long enough for anyone to study them today. Art and personal expression face an even steeper survival problem. Music, performed rather than recorded, vanishes the instant the performance ends, leaving no trace unless someone happens to describe it afterward in a form durable enough to last. Dance, storytelling, oral poetry, entire traditions of spoken performance that likely made up an enormous share of how ancient people actually spent their time together, survive today only in the rare cases where someone eventually wrote a description down, often centuries after the tradition itself had already changed considerably from its original form. By now, picture that figure from the Hook again, standing alone with no name, no trace, no object left behind. Multiply that single absence by roughly 90 billion, and you start to get an honest sense of the actual scale of what this video is really asking about. So is all of this loss just diffuse and evenly spread out, one gradually fading detail at a time? Not entirely. Some of it clusters into specific identifiable gaps, entire chapters that we know existed, that we can even partially see the edges of, but genuinely cannot read. The Indus Valley Civilization, which flourished roughly 4,000 years ago across parts of what is now Pakistan and northwest India, left behind thousands of examples of a written script carved into seals, pottery, and other artifacts. Researchers have the actual writing. It survived, and it remains, to this day, undeciphered. Nobody currently knows what it says, because there's no equivalent of the Rosetta Stone for this particular script. No known bilingual text linking it to a language researchers can already read. An entire major civilization, with cities that show evidence of sophisticated urban planning and organized trade networks, is sitting there in front of researchers in its own words, completely unreadable, right now, in real time. The Indus script isn't unique in this respect either, just especially well known. Several other ancient writing systems remain partially or entirely undeciphered today, including Linear A from Bronze Age Crete and Rongorongo, a script carved into wood on Easter Island whose meaning, structure, and even basic purpose remain genuinely disputed among researchers. In each case, the physical writing survived intact, sometimes in substantial quantity. What's missing isn't the evidence itself, but the specific key needed to translate it, the kind of lucky cross-reference like the Rosetta Stone provided. For Egyptian hieroglyphs, that happens to exist for surprisingly few ancient scripts. Rising sea levels since the end of the last ice age created another kind of black box entirely, this one literal rather than linguistic. As glaciers melted roughly 20,000 years ago onward, Global sea levels rose by well over 100 meters, submerging enormous stretches of coastline that had previously been dry land. Inhabited land, in some cases likely home to some of the very first coastal and river delta settlements humans ever built. Regions like Doggerland, once connecting Britain to mainland Europe, and Sunderland, a vast landmass in Southeast Asia now mostly underwater, are believed by many researchers to have supported substantial ancient populations, entire societies now sitting on the ocean floor, largely unexcavated, this specific kind of underwater archaeology remaining extraordinarily expensive and technically difficult compared to digging on dry land. Fishing trawlers working the North Sea have occasionally dredged up direct physical evidence of exactly this. Lost world, ancient tools, animal bones, even fragments of human remains, pulled up from the seabed decades before researchers fully understood what they were looking at. Some estimates suggest Doggerland alone may have supported thousands of people at various points before being gradually submerged, an entire regional population whose settlements, burial sites, and daily life now sit under tens of meters of North Sea water, essentially inaccessible to the kind of careful, systematic excavation that land-based archaeology depends on. Sundaland's scale is even harder to fully grasp. At its largest extent during the last ice age, when sea levels sat dramatically lower than today, this landmass connected much of what are now separate Southeast Asian islands into a single continuous region, potentially home to substantial early human populations navigating a landscape that simply doesn't exist anymore, replaced entirely by open ocean. So what does it actually mean practically for so much of the human story to be sitting in places this hard to reach? It means the shape of history as we currently understand it is disproportionately built from whatever happened to survive on dry land. In climates that preserve organic material reasonably well, using technology that was already durable enough to last, everything else, entire coastlines, entire unwritten languages, entire civilizations whose script we simply can't read yet, gets pushed to the margins of the story not because it mattered less, but because it happened to leave behind evidence that was harder for us to find or harder to understand once found. Not every gap in the record comes from simple decay or bad luck either. Some of it was lost through deliberate human choice, sometimes catastrophically. The Library of Alexandria, one of the largest and most significant repositories of ancient written knowledge, is believed to have held anywhere from tens of thousands to several 100,000 scrolls, covering subjects ranging across science, medicine, literature, and history from across the ancient Mediterranean world. Its gradual decline and eventual loss spread across several incidents over centuries rather than a single dramatic fire, destroyed an enormous, irreplaceable concentration of ancient written knowledge, much of which likely existed nowhere else in no other copy, anywhere in the ancient world. Similar losses have played out repeatedly throughout history wherever concentrated collections of unique written material met war, fire, neglect, or simple political decision. Each time an entire slice of documented human knowledge, sometimes representing centuries of accumulated observation and thought, disappeared essentially all at once rather than fading gradually the way undocumented oral history typically does. Even when a library or archive survives largely intact, the passage of enough time introduces its own quieter form of loss. Languages shift, scripts fall out of common use, and the specific cultural context needed to fully understand an old text gradually erodes even when the physical document itself remains perfectly legible. A surviving text isn't automatically a fully understood one, and plenty of historical material sits in exactly that uncomfortable middle ground. Readable in a technical sense, but only partially. Understood in the deeper sense that actually matters. Here's the part of this story that quietly reframes everything that came before it. It's tempting to treat this entire problem as something that belongs strictly to the ancient past, a limitation that stopped mattering once writing, printing, and eventually digital technology arrived to fix it permanently. But something surprisingly similar is happening again right now, in a form most people rarely stop to think about. Digital information, despite feeling permanent, is often remarkably fragile. File formats become obsolete and unreadable within a matter of decades. Storage media physically degrades. Companies hosting personal photos, messages, and entire digital lives shut down or change their terms, sometimes deleting everything without much warning at all. Researchers studying this problem have started calling it the digital dark age, the unsettling possibility that vast amounts of early 21st century personal and cultural history could become effectively unreadable within a surprisingly short span of time, simply due to changing formats and neglected archiving. Concrete examples of this are already piling up even within a single generation. Early websites, Entire online communities and vast amounts of software from just a few decades ago have already become effectively inaccessible, either because the platforms hosting them shut down or because the specific technology needed to open and run them no longer exists in any practical, widely available form. Digital preservation organizations work specifically to counter this. Archiving snapshots of the digital preservation organizations work specifically to counter this. Archiving snapshots of the web and rescuing old file formats, but the sheer volume of material being generated today makes comprehensive preservation genuinely impossible, meaning specific. Deliberate choices are already being made right now about what gets saved and what quietly disappears. There's a particular irony sitting inside all of this. Physical materials from thousands of years ago, clay tablets, stone carvings, sometimes survive remarkably well precisely because they required no special technology to eventually read again, just eyes and patience. Digital information, despite being created with far more sophisticated technology, often proves considerably less durable over the long run, entirely dependent on a specific, continuously maintained chain of hardware and software compatibility that can break at any single link. In other words, the same basic problem that erased most of prehistoric human experience hasn't actually been solved. It's just changed shape and changed timescale from stone and bones slowly, decomposing over tens of thousands of years, to a hard drive quietly failing or a platform shutting down within a single human lifetime. That reframing matters because it suggests something uncomfortable about how we think, about our own moment in history. Future researchers looking back at right now may face gaps in the record that feel eerily similar in kind, if not in scale, to the gaps we currently face looking back at prehistoric humans' entire lives, entire ordinary daily details, quietly slipping through the cracks of whatever technology happened to be considered permanent at the time. There's a modest but genuine comfort buried inside that uncomfortable comparison, though. Every generation that has ever lived has faced some version of the same basic problem, and every generation has still managed to pass enough forward through whatever imperfect method was available to them at the time for the next generation to build something meaningful on top of it. The record has never been complete. It has simply been good enough over and over again for the story to keep moving forward, even while the overwhelming majority of its actual detail quietly falls away behind it. So picture that figure from the beginning one more time, standing alone with nothing left behind to identify them. They aren't an unusual case or a particularly unlucky one. They're closer to a fair representation of what actually happened to the overwhelming majority of everyone who has ever lived, quietly absorbed back into a history that was never really built to record them in the first place. What we call human history, the version most people picture when they hear those words, is really a thin, carefully preserved sliver sitting on top of an almost unimaginably larger, mostly silent majority. Every documented king, every named battle, every artifact sitting behind museum glass survived by exception, not by rule. That doesn't make the recorded portion less valuable. If anything, it makes it more remarkable that any of it survived at all, against such overwhelming odds of simply disappearing the way almost everything else already has. Every surviving scroll, every legible inscription, every preserved bone represents a small specific victory against decay, war, neglect, and simple time. A victory that never happened for the vast, silent majority sitting just beyond what we're currently able to see. It also suggests something worth carrying forward beyond simple historical curiosity. If most of what actually happened has already vanished without a trace, then the specific fragments that did survive deserve to be treated less like a complete, settled record, and more like scattered survivors of an enormous, largely unrecorded flood, worth studying carefully but never mistaken for the whole story they're often assumed to represent. But it's worth remembering every time a familiar historical fact gets repeated that it represents an exception to the general rule, not the rule itself. Most of what actually happened to most of the people who actually lived it is already gone, and very likely always will be. Somewhere behind every story we do, know there are countless others we never will.